Hey, I'm Jason, and this is Supply and Demand Quick Dives. So I'm going to do a video where I pick a topic. Today it's the war in Yemen, and just give you the rundown, give you basically everything you need to know. And the reason that I'm going to be talking about the war in Yemen today is because it actually might come to an end either in this year, the remaining portion of 2022, or 2023. And this is very exciting news because it's been going on, in fact, for about 7 years now. This is a very brutal war that has killed as many people as I'm going to show you in several slides from now, and it would certainly be a very good thing for everybody if the United States ended its involvement and if there were some sort of peace deal negotiated. The reason that I'm sharing this is because a lot of foreign policy developments are being overshadowed by what's going on in Eastern Europe with the war between Russia and Ukraine. When it comes to American foreign policy, those are the most common subjects talked about, and Yemen has been relegated to the 3rd or 15th page of the newspaper for several years now. So I want to put this on your radar so that you know what's going on with the U.S.-backed war in Yemen, and I'm going to tell you all about it, starting all the way back in 1990. So let's get started. I'm going to give you a brief timeline. So in 1990, or up to 1990, Yemen was actually two countries. It was split between a northern portion, northern Yemen, which I believe was just called the Yemen Arab Republic, and southern Yemen, which was called the People's Republic of Yemen. Why might that sound familiar? Well, because that is a typical name for Soviet-affiliated states across the world. So this was a communist sort of vassal state of the Soviet Union and had the support of both the Soviet Union and Cuba. So that was the background. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, President Ali Abdullah Saleh united North and South Yemen into one country and became the first president. Before the division, it had been ruled by a king, similar to how Saudi Arabia is ruled. When this happened, when the United States launched its Gulf War against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, President Saleh actually aligned himself with Saddam Hussein, and this garnered the anger of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia actually responded by expelling 1 million Yemeni migrant workers who were remitting income to their households back home in Yemen, which caused a great deal of economic hardship for the people at that time. And I'm only sharing this not because it really pertains too much to the current war, but because it sort of shows you how the relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Yemen have sort of been tangled and been a push and pull throughout history, throughout the last 32 years of history. Now, if we fast forward to 2002, Saleh actually allied himself with the United States and began to allow airstrikes within the country, and in order for the United States to take on its enemy Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and there had been a well-established branch of Al-Qaeda at this time. The AQAP, that's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, were responsible for the attack on the USS Cole in the harbor of the Yemen port Aden, which may also be pronounced Aden, I'm not sure. And so Saleh sought to ally himself with the United States in this respect. There wasn't a whole lot of war on terror activity, however, between 2003 and 2009 when it really picked back up again. And that's where we come into the Obama administration, which in 2009 made a deal with the Saleh administration, or the Saleh regime. Really more of a regime because Saleh was, by all accounts, a pretty brutal dictator who was very self-interested and didn't do a whole lot for the population of that poor country. But it was revealed in 2010 that the Obama administration had made a deal with the Saleh regime to basically allow drone strikes within the country with no limit, with no cap. And there was a quotation from a State Department cable in which there was a message sent to National Security Advisor John Brennan from President Saleh saying, "I have given you an open door on terrorism so that I am not responsible." The way that this worked was the Saleh regime would claim that attacks against Al-Qaeda in Yemen were actually put on by the Yemen army itself, when in reality they were direct U.S. drone strikes. The problem originated when these drone strikes that were carried out by the Americans actually killed many civilians in Yemen, and so that led to massive protests when this news came out, basically confirming what a lot of people had suspected, which is that these were American drone strikes the entire time that were killing Yemeni civilians, and that the president had essentially allowed this to happen and even encouraged it. So in 2009 to 2011, the U.S. continued airstrikes against al-Qaeda targets in Yemen, and the Yemeni government under Saleh launched Operation Scorched Earth, which used U.S. support to wage war against the Houthi rebels in the north. And so while the United States was waging war on al-Qaeda, the Yemeni government under Saleh was basically taking out Saleh's political opponents in the north. And there are even some reports that say that he was using the Houthis, certain sects of the Houthi rebels, to attack his own forces to keep certain parts of his own army from becoming too powerful. So that is certainly a very different way of doing things from how we're used to out here, in the West. And shout out to Scott Horton for providing that information in his excellent book on the War on Terror. January 2011, protests against the Saleh regime begin. At this point, 40% of the population lives on $2 or less than $2, a day. This information comes from this article here. I do apologize for the typos. A lot of times you see these in older news articles, but this is a Guardian article originally, and I got it via the Hindu. And then a lot of this other timeline information comes from Al Jazeera. All right, and this is just a chart showing inflation in a couple of Arab Spring countries. That would be Syria, Yemen, Egypt, and Libya, which are not the only Arab Spring countries that had uprisings in 2011, 2012, but there was definitely a spike of inflation in Yemen of 19.5%, which is over 2 times the rate that prices are increasing here in the United States in 2022. So just wanted to point that out as well. That's 2011. Now, in November 2011, Saleh is basically forced to give up power as part of a deal with the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperation Coalition. And when you look at the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Coalition, it is essentially Saudi Arabia and friends. So he makes an agreement with this particular. So he makes an agreement with the GCC to give up his power. In return, he is not prosecuted. He is given immunity from prosecution, even though he's basically a corrupt bastard. And this actually angers the protesters even more, because they would like to see a lot more punishment for Saleh other than just getting to quietly walk away from his authority. And the guy who replaces him as vice president, Adraba Mansour Hadi, who is backed by the Saudi Arabian regime, and is why they were comfortable with making this deal. So 2011 to 2015, U.S. airstrikes against AQAP are continued. In 2012, Yemen holds an election, and Hadi is the only candidate. So this was not exactly an establishment of democracy, even though the United States treated it as such, and all of the U.S. allies treated it as such. To give you an example of how that worked, or just to be able to visualize it, this is the ballot in that 2012 election. There's Hadi's picture, and there is a checkbox for you to make your mark, and that's it. There's exactly one candidate. That's your choice, and so not exactly what we would call an election here in the United States or in any country that actually has, working, viable democratic processes. But Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time was very enthusiastic in a statement about the Yemeni presidential election, and she said in a press release, "This election sends a clear message that the people of Yemen are looking forward to a brighter democratic future." Wow, that's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and this is from NPR as well as the State Department press release itself. Just in case you have any doubts whatsoever, Hillary Clinton was well aware that this was a fraudulent sham election. Everybody was. NPR was reporting such a couple of weeks, maybe a month after it happened. I think that I think their article that they ran on the subject where this photo came from was in March, and the election was in February. So it might have been in April, but yeah, within a few weeks after the election, everybody knew it was a sham, except for the general American public, because we don't pay attention or care what happens in these countries. So moving on, 2011, protests continue. Saleh, like I said, is given immunity from prosecution, and little did we know about Saleh. It turns out that he is actually ethnically a member of the Zayda Shia minority in Yemen, which is another term for the Houthi rebellion. So Houthis just, I believe, refer to a specific family that makes up a large governing faction in that within that ethnic sect of the country. It's kind of hard to put these words together sometimes. I apologize. But yeah, so Saleh then went and he took part of his army and he joined with the Houthi rebellion against the vice president and now president Hadi, who was backed again by Saudi Arabia. Now, in July of 2014, basically pissed off over Hadi's rule because he continues to do the same sorts of things that Saleh did, and the Houthis and Saudi Arabia are not friends. In fact, they are quite the opposite. They are enemies of one another. Houthi fighters of Zayda Shia minority attacked the capital from a northern city called Sada, where that was basically their base at the time. In January 2014, Houthis have seized the capital, and the presidential palace is seized, and Hadi flees. And he flees south to where a new provincial government structure has been set up. That's basically the government of the coalition forces, which there's not much to that at all. And here in this day and age in 2022, the Houthis are definitely winning the war. So that's where we're at now. And in 2017, there was an interesting breakup between the Saleh regime, or the Saleh and his army, and the Houthi. So they had this alliance of theirs dissolved. So I'm just showing a couple of headlines from 2017 and 2018: collapse of Houthi-Saleh alliance and the future of Yemen's war. That is not particularly important to the story, but it's interesting how, Saleh, even though he was ousted, keeps popping up throughout this story. November 2014 to January 2015, it turns out that after the Houthis took power, the White House was coordinating with them to launch airstrikes in Yemen against Al-Qaeda, because one thing about the Houthis that is actually quite good for the United States is that they really, really hate Al-Qaeda. They are, in fact, sworn enemies of Al-Qaeda, and so we were working together with the Houthis. The White House was working together with the Houthis to make targets of Al-Qaeda in Yemen and kill them. Again, these drone strikes are not surgical, and they do come with civilian casualties, but they were definitely, the White House was definitely working with these people to kill Al-Qaeda militants. And then in March 2015, Saudi Arabia got into a coalition with the UAE and several other Gulf states, basically every Arab nation in the Persian Gulf except for Yemen, and launched this coalition war against the Houthi regime in Yemen. And then what was really surprising is that in April of 2015, the Obama administration announced that it would be joining that coalition's effort and providing support to it in the form of weapons sales and maintenance on the Saudi Air Force and things like that. And we'll go into the specifics of that here in a couple slides. In October of 2015, the coalition had retaken 5 provinces away from the Houthi regime, and the war basically entered a stalemate, which, if you know anything about stalemates, or if you know anything about World War I, a stalemate is prime condition for a lot of loss of life. And so this is definitely not a good thing, and that's basically where the war has remained for the last 7 years. In strategic shift, U.S. draws closer to Yemeni rebels. The State Department actually released, or it may not have been the State Department, I believe it was actually the Defense Department, but they admitted in early 2015, in January 2015, that they had been working with the Houthi regime in order to target Al-Qaeda militants through those, basically the 3 to 4 months between November 2014 and January 2015. And then again, it was April 2015 that U.S. officials pivoted, and there were even U.S. generals as part of the Central Command who told various media outlets, on condition of anonymity, of course, that Saudi intervention in Yemen was a bad idea. So there was a lot of division over this action, and I have some quotations from another Middle East advisor in the Obama administration that reflect the same kind of thing. All right, and this is just a chart showing combatants and civilians killed by drone strikes, direct U.S. drone strikes in Yemen, going all the way from 2002 when it was first authorized to this spike that you see here in 2009. That's when the Obama administration made the deal with the Saleh regime to do these, peaked in 2012 and started to taper off in 2017. And so now the United States is not really putting a whole lot of work into its war against AQAP, even though they still exist. Most U.S. efforts seem to be going into allowing the coalition Air Force to fly and drop bombs on the Houthis. So this is what the territorial separation of Yemen looks like. So this green that you see here is under the control of the Houthis. They seized the capital Sana'a, which is here, back in 2014, and so they have ruled from there ever since. These are the provinces that have been taken back by the coalition regime, by the coalition governments and their forces, and these gray areas are the areas that are the most under the influence of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, what's interesting, this comes from Al Jazeera, by the way, and this is as of February 2022. What's interesting is that if you overlay the bombings of the air raids that have happened in Yemen over these years, they don't match up at all with the territorial holdings of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Again, the war is not against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia's main enemy is the Houthis, and they don't much care about what Al-Qaeda is doing, even though our sworn enemy in the United States is supposed to be Al-Qaeda, the people who, knocked down the World Trade Center and bombed the USS Cole in Yemen, and we're also responsible for planning the bombing of the Detroit airline bombing, what's better known as the underpants bombing that was foiled by, actually I'm not sure how it was foiled, I just know that it was unsuccessful, but AQAP is responsible for all of these attacks, and they are not our enemies in Yemen currently. So when you overlay these attacks, they do not match up with the territorial holdings of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which I have loosely designated with these gray circles here. So, and that would be as of 2021. Now, what is going on in Yemen as far as the humanitarian crisis and the difficulty of acquiring resources and all of these things? Well, and this gray line is the national fuel requirement, and what that is basically an average monthly import of fuel that was recorded in 2015 before the war began. And then what this green line is telling you is how much of that amount of fuel, that 2015 average, basically how much of that fuel has actually been received by the Yemenis ever since this war began. And this chart is basically only showing you 2020. And I have some other information that goes up to 2021, but this data does have a delay on it, so just keep that in mind. But you can see how it averages 34, 38, 48, 24, 15, down to 4% in September of 2020, the percent of the national fuel requirement met by imports of fuel in Yemen. So basically the only way that fuel and food gets into Yemen right now, because the major ports of Yemen have been blocked off by Saudi air forces and naval forces, and those two major ports are basically Hodeidah and Aden, or Aden. Because those ports have been blocked off, the only way that food gets in is through humanitarian corridors, basically from the UN and associated organizations. And so this is what's making it into the country. On the other hand, we have their inflation of food prices reflecting the scarcity of food in the country. This green line is showing you how much it costs for a basic food basket in comparison to 2015 levels. So we had 110% in January of 2020, going all the way up to 156% in September of 2020. So it's definitely definitely not a good situation as far as affordability goes, and people are definitely starving. There is just outright starvation in the country, and I have some numbers on that here shortly. But 25% of the fuel needs, this is as of March 2021, okay, so a little over a year ago, 25% of the fuel needs were making it into the country as of March 2021, and the food basket at that point was 218% of 2015 prices. So there's a very big resource crisis going on in the country. Again, it's because of these blockades. Food doesn't go in unless it's through some humanitarian corridor, through an international organization like the UN Food Program or whatever. So that's what's going on. Casualties. So as of the end of 2021, this estimate was done in November. The UN estimated that there would be 377,000 deaths by the end of the year. About 40% of those would be due to direct conflict. So we're talking about violent airstrikes and ground collisions, landmines, things like that. And then about 60% would be due indirectly from famine and the destruction of infrastructure. When you don't have sewage, it's very easy for societies, for communities, villages, towns to develop these sorts of what we would call 19th and 16th and before century diseases like cholera. These things that are just spread by human waste being out and open, and so the bacteria and various things spreading in that way. And so when you bomb an infrastructure, when you bomb out a lot of the roads, bridges, and sewage, it becomes very easy for those kinds of you might also call third world diseases to spread. The Saudis, again, they have been blockading these ports ever since 2015, so we're looking at 7 years of pressure in this area, 7 years of potential famine. Essentially, nearly 70% of the casualties have been children under the age of 5, and airstrikes have killed about 9,000 civilians. Airstrikes being directly carried out by the Saudis and the Emiratis and Qatar and all of these other coalition countries. Now, why is the U.S. government involved? I'm taking this excerpt. This is an excerpt from an interview with Robert Malley, who was a Middle East policy advisor in the Obama administration. And this is an interview he gave with Aaron Mate recently. I believe it was this year. And so I'm just going to read you an excerpt of that, and you can certainly read along. But he says, there's a lot I'm very proud of having served under President Obama. I think we could have a whole session on that, but one of the places that is hardest for me to come to terms with is our policy towards Yemen. To try to understand what the Obama administration was about, I've tried to explain to myself, to try to understand how we got to where we are. Let's not forget at the time we were in the middle of these negotiations with Iran, trying to reach a nuclear deal, which was extremely unpopular with our traditional allies in the region, from Israel to Saudi Arabia to the UAE and others. Now, the thing that you have to understand about the Middle East is in the news media, it's often portrayed as though the Middle East is just the Middle East, like one cohesive block of countries, especially if you watch Fox News, is portrayed as one cohesive block of countries who hate us, right, or who hate the West, essentially. And that's, for one thing, not true. It's not a cohesive block of hate necessarily, but the other thing is that there are alliances between and within these countries. And the thing about the Gulf states that are allied against Yemen in this war is that they all have one thing in common. Among other things, they have one thing in common, and that is their hatred of Iran. And that is a commonality that they also happen to share with Israel. Okay, so while there's a lot of tension here in the Middle East, but we're often told, especially after 2001, that they are all just one cohesive block of enemies of the U.S. That's not necessarily or really how it works. So all of these countries really hate Iran, and because they believe that the Houthis are backed by Iran, they also hate the Houthis, and they have other reasons for hating the Houthis in general. Right, so Israel to Saudi Arabia to the UAE and others, and the Saudis came to us and said that they were about to intervene in Yemen to attack the Houthis that had toppled the legitimate government of the internationally recognized government at the time, and they asked for our assistance. And then this is after he mentions that he himself was against this U.S. involvement. And then he says, but there was a strong view among a number of cabinet members at the time that this was a decades-old relationship, very important to U.S. interests in the region, and that it was close to a breaking point because, and now I could do the list, because of the support, what was perceived as the support of the toppling of President Mubarak in Egypt, support for the Arab Spring, what was perceived as over proximity to the Muslim Brotherhood, and then the mother of all sins, the negotiations with Iran in order to try to reach a nuclear deal. So the Saudis and the UAE were not happy with the United States over the Obama JCPOA, more commonly known as the nuclear deal. All right, so that's the background. We essentially had to, some have said, placate the Saudis in order to preserve an alliance which is not the best alliance in the world. Doesn't seem to be serving either party particularly well, except for Saudi Arabia in this case over the last 7 years. And what has the United States government done in this war? What has the U.S. government contributed? So we do several things. I keep saying we. The government does several things. The Defense Department, air-to-air refueling of Saudi Air Force jets, sales of ammunition and F-15 fighter jets, and then one thing that came out very recently. This was actually June, so it was this month. The Washington Post and Security Force Monitor, which is part of Columbia University, analyzed 39 coalition squadrons, found that 19 of them, so about half, were awarded U.S. Defense Department contracts over the last 7 years to basically to both supply the jets, to supply the ammunitions, and to train the pilots. And these are squadrons that have been involved in these 9,000 civilian killings that I mentioned earlier, and there is some talk among other UN members about the possibility that a lot of these attacks by the UAE in Saudi Arabia are actually verifiable war crimes under international law, which goes back to the Geneva Convention. But yeah, that's essentially, it's not the most, the U.S. is not the most red-handed party involved, obviously, because it's not necessarily our army that's going in and causing the destruction itself, but we are providing a great deal of services to the coalition that allow it to continue to basically strangle Yemen into submission and cause all of these deaths, both from hunger, starvation, disease, as well as civilian killings via airstrikes. So now, why is it a good thing that this thing, not why is it a good thing? I think I've already explained to you why it's a good thing for this thing to end, but why are there indications that this thing might actually end after 7 long years? Well, the most recent ceasefire began in April. It was supposed to coincide with, I believe, Ramadan. Yeah, it was supposed to coincide with Ramadan. It was going to be 2 months long. And for once, actually, the ceasefire has extended for longer than it was originally intended. So it was supposed to be a 2-month ceasefire, which would expire in early June 1st. And instead, it has actually been extended. Now, so it was extended on June 2nd to, I'm not exactly sure when, but that is a really good sign, because so far all ceasefires in the past have not been extended, and I believe there have been several that have ended early, that have ended before they were supposed to, which, if you know anything about Israel and Palestine, that's more often how it goes. So, and then the other thing is there has been a coalition of members of Congress, the United States Congress in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and this coalition has been growing steadily over the years. So it started with a handful a few years ago, and now there are 50 members of Congress who have co-signed a bill or I think co-sponsor is actually bipartisan group of 50 members of Congress introduced HJ Resolution 87 today, legislation to invoke constitutional war powers to end unauthorized United States military support involvement in Saudi Arabia's brutal war in Yemen. So there's a lot more support now among United States legislators to actually put the war to an end. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe they just want to focus on Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot more enthusiasm among elected officials for actually ending this war. And it looks like I don't know, there's probably not a real chance of this new war powers resolution passing, but it's possible that this part of the Democratic Party, along with their Republican allies, at least in this one regard, these are typical members of Congress who hate each other. So we're talking about the Squad, your Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and your Rashida Tlaib, and people like Thomas Massie, who, is leans more the way that I do politically. But so you have these very unlikely bedfellows coming together to create a new war powers resolution to completely cut off the funding sources that the United States has to support this war in Yemen, which would definitely be a good thing. Whether it's going to pass, I don't have any way of knowing, but that is the situation that we see today. And the hopeful thing, the best thing to see is that we see an end to this war, whether the United States is involved in that, in bringing about the end or not. But it would certainly help if the United States would get out, because, again, there is a lot of air support being provided to the Saudi regime. One foreign policy analyst who is a bit of a Yemen expert named Michael Horton actually went so far as to say that the United States was acting as Al-Qaeda's air force in Yemen, because of the heavy-handedness and how much the Saudi Arabian Air Force and the UAE jets depend on American support in order to be able to wage this war. So I'm going to end it there on a positive note. The war may end here in the next, maybe 6 months to a year, and that would certainly be a good thing. But this is the war in Yemen. I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about how American foreign policy works, and just to understand a little bit more of the background in this whole mess in the Middle East, and how the U.S. government, armed with your taxpayer dollars, if you live in the U.S., maybe you're watching from overseas, but if you're an American, the United States is using your resources essentially to do this. So I thought that was important to share. I'll be back tomorrow with Supply and Demand Daily. We'll get data on the jobless claims, which comes out every Thursday, as well as a couple of other key indicators, and I'll be talking about the inventory build and what that means about where the economy is headed. That's both retail and wholesale inventories, building up stocks of goods among sellers of goods, and what that means. So I'm going to leave it right there, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Thank you very much for attending Supply and Demand Dives. I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.